November 1944. The Philippine Sea moved under a heavy blanket of dawn haze, the horizon reduced to a thin, trembling line where dark water dissolved into a pale metallic sky. The ocean carried the cold breath of morning, the waves rolling with slow, deliberate weight, as if gathering strength for something waiting just beyond visibility. The wind was low, steady, heavy with salt and the smell of fuel drifting across a surface scarred by surviving fragments of 1,000 battles. Radios remained silent by command. No voices, no chatter, only the deep mechanical heartbeat of naval engines, pushing steel hulls through indifferent water. The war in the Pacific had already stretched far beyond the limits of endurance, and every man aboard the American ships felt the tension seeping through bulkheads, vibrating in deck plates, tightening throats that tasted metal. November sunlight refracted through fog, like light passing through frozen glass, and for a brief moment everything appeared motionless. Sea, sky, ships, men, time itself. The stillness felt unnatural, as though the world held its breath. On the deck of the destroyer USS Johnston, the crew moved with quiet precision, their movements fast but controlled, avoiding unnecessary noise. Weapons were checked, torpedo mounts secured, ammunition lines positioned, gauges verified for pressure and temperature. The men's faces were pale beneath helmets and caps, eyes bloodshot from nights spent awake beneath red lamps in cramped operations compartments. They were young, most of them barely past adolescence, but their expressions carried something far older, an exhausted resolve shaped by storms, fire, steel, and the endless grind of naval war. Oil-stained gloves tightened around railings, slick with condensation. Breath appeared in thin white streams in the cold morning air, disappearing instantly, swallowed by the wind. Captain Ernest Evans stood near the bridge, one hand resting against cold steel, the other gripping binoculars held tightly against his chest. His features were hard, carved from the relentless reality of command, eyes sharp behind the glass as they cut through the distressed morning haze. He watched the invisible horizon where enemy ships waited, unseen but certain. His uniform clung to his frame, soaked from spray and mist, the collar stiff with dried salt. Every man aboard Johnston knew his voice, his certainty, his refusal to accept defeat. He had once told his crew that the ship would never retreat so long as he lived, and no one had doubted him. The destroyer beneath his feet shuddered as turbines maintained their cadence, valves hissing, pistons hammering, propellers carving through thousands of tons of cold Pacific water. Miles to the west, hidden behind fog thick as smoke, the Imperial Japanese Navy advanced in silence. Their formation moved like a steel phalanx cutting through the sea, the largest battleships ever built leading the way. Among them, the Yamato, an 18-inch gun titan, a floating fortress of naval supremacy, her hull armored like a mountain of iron shaped into motion. Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge, his face emotionless, framed by glass streaked with sea spray. He wore the expression of a man pulled forward by the unstoppable weight of orders and expectation, his thoughts buried beneath layers of duty, calculation, and inevitability. Behind him, officers tracked bearing and range, compasses trembling, rangefinders extending outward like the eyes of a hunter preparing for the strike. Kurita's fleet believed they faced the remnants of an American task force, escort carriers, lightly armed support units, scattered survivors fleeing from earlier engagements. They had been told the American Navy was retreating, that the path ahead held an opening to sever the invasion forces supporting General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The Japanese formation carried the power to crush an entire fleet in minutes. The combined force of Yamato, Congo-class battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Guns capable of reducing steel to molten ruin in a single broadside. Torpedoes that could crack a hull like bone. Armor too thick for conventional fire to penetrate. Sovereignty of the sea forged into metal and steam. Yet the ocean remained deceptively silent. The faint beginnings of sunrise cut through the fog like a blade, illuminating just the edges of hulls that lurked beyond visibility. The American ships of Taffy III, escort carriers and destroyers assigned not for frontline assault, but for remote protection of landing forces, continued forward unaware of the nightmare moving toward them. Engines hummed at cruising speed, propellers churning steady vortices behind sterns that cleaved water cleanly. On the flight decks of the carriers, aircraft sat chained in rows, their wings wet from mist, maintenance crews wiping moisture from cockpit glass without speaking. The crews sensed tension, but did not yet understand its source. The rising sun reflected off metal surfaces, turning the fleet into silhouettes outlined by a pale ring of light. The glow grew brighter, lifting the ocean from darkness, revealing the fine trembling texture of waves, carrying the cold breath of the coming day. Aboard the destroyer USS Hull, a radio man adjusted frequencies repeatedly, static crackling and fading in irregular bursts. He looked to his officer, waiting for instruction. The officer simply nodded and turned his gaze back to the horizon, fingers tightening along the metal edge of the console. The smell of hot circuitry and lubricants filled the compartment. Quiet footsteps moved overhead as sailors took positions, waiting for orders yet to come. Sleep-deprived eyes scanned instruments for the slightest deviation, breaths held, hearts pounding ever so slightly faster. The destroyers were small compared to battleships, thin hulls, light armor, limited artillery. They were built for speed, agility, torpedo strikes, close-range engagements, not prolonged battles at extreme distances. Against battleships, they were technically prey, outranged, outarmored, outgunned. Against Yamato, they were insects before a storm. But none of this truth mattered yet. What mattered was silence. What mattered was the slow, inevitable approach of forces converging without seeing each other fully. The fog clung tightly to the sea, refusing to lift, refusing to reveal intentions. The ocean itself seemed unwilling to choose sides. Below decks, engines roared inside steel housings that vibrated like living organs. Crewmen worked among pipes and valves, the air hot and metal-tasting, sweat collecting along their collarbones even in morning chill. The rhythmic pounding of pistons and turbines beat through their skulls. They knew nothing of the Japanese fleet hidden beyond the mist, only that orders carried urgency and tension they felt in marrow. They had been fighting for months without pause, through typhoons, artillery storms, kamikaze strikes. Fear never vanished, it simply dulled. Exhaustion replaced panic, discipline replaced doubt. On the carriers, pilots stood near their aircraft with helmets tucked beneath arms, boots tapping steel, waiting for signals. They watched crew chiefs securing tie-downs and checking fuel lines, breath held in anticipation, not of flight, but of possibility. The war had taught them that quiet meant threat. The gentlest dawn could precede annihilation. The softest tide could conceal death. The last remains of night dissolved slowly. Light began to break across the Philippine Sea in a gray-white horizon that spread outward, like smoke clearing from a battlefield. The fog rippled, revealing the faintest suggestion of shapes to the west, dark outlines rising and sinking behind the curvature of waves. It took seconds for bearings to register, seconds for binoculars to focus, seconds for confusion to erupt into realization, into shock, into motion so sudden that restraint collapsed. On the bridge of USS Johnston, an officer lowered his binoculars, voice cracking as he forced the words upward through his throat. The horizon filled with steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. A fleet too large to comprehend in a single glance. Gun barrels the size of tree trunks emerging through the fog. Towers rising like silhouettes of black mountains. The ocean beneath them foamed and shuddered under the force of displacement. The silence ruptured. Orders erupted across radios, calm voices sharpened by urgency, feet pounding steel decks, alarm bells blaring. Radar screens confirmed what eyes already knew. An overwhelming enemy force was charging toward the American ships at attack speed. The carriers could not outrun them. They could not outgun them. They could not survive without protection. The destroyers turned. The sea seemed to freeze for a moment as the realization spread across the American formation. They were facing a fleet of capital ships with guns designed to obliterate targets at distances beyond visual range, and the only vessels positioned to defend the carriers were 3 small destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, thin-skinned, exposed, vulnerable. The logic of war dictated retreat. Mathematics dictated that defeat was inevitable. Strategy demanded sacrifice. No doctrine accounted for what was about to unfold. Aboard Johnston, Captain Evans looked across the deck through the trembling horizon and saw the impossible. He tightened his hand around the rail, jaw setting firmly. He did not ask for orders. He did not wait for confirmation. He did not calculate odds. His voice erupted through the bridge, deep and unwavering, cutting through chaos like steel through cloth. He gave the command that would shape the fate of every man aboard and rewrite the memory of naval warfare. Full speed. Engines pushed past limits, turbines screaming, deck plates rattling under acceleration. Johnston lurched forward violently, carving a white wake through the water as she turned directly toward the Japanese fleet. Her bow lifted briefly against the swell, then slammed down, sending sheets of spray vaulting across crewmen gripping rails tighter than bone. The ship accelerated into the heart of an ocean that suddenly felt infinite and terminal. The crew came alive instantly, moving not with fear, but with resolve sharpened by the impossible clarity of hopeless odds. Ammunition handlers sprinted, voices tight and sharp. Gun captains shouted coordinates, adjusting elevation and bearing manually with movements that bordered on instinct. Torpedo teams prepared their mounts, bodies leaning into straps, braced for recoil. The radio room crackled with transmissions, urgent and clipped. The engine room roared with power far beyond nominal thresholds, gauges trembling at redline. The destroyer became a single organism driven by purpose so absolute it erased doubt. The sea rushed beneath hulls like a river of steel. Fog tore apart under the blast of speed, revealing more of the massive silhouettes rising ahead. American sailors watched battleships growing larger, closer, impossibly near, their towering superstructures emerging from deep haze like monuments carved from darkness. It felt surreal, monstrous, mythic. They could see the barrels of main batteries slowly rotating toward them, gigantic tubes long enough to swallow a room whole. They could see water columns rising from forward guns as Japanese lookouts spotted movement across the sea. To starboard, USS Hull accelerated as well, pushing engines to shuddering extremes. USS Heermann followed, 3 destroyers racing headlong into a fleet that could crush them with a single broadside. The escort carriers behind them changed course, attempting to escape, engines vibrating at maximum without margin to spare. Pilots aboard the decks of the carriers watched the destroyers charge and felt the surge of stunned disbelief, many gripping railings until their hands went numb. The sea narrowed between the advancing forces. The fog finally separated in long curling sheets, revealing the Japanese line clearly for the first time. Yamato at the center, her massive frame dwarfing surrounding cruisers that themselves towered over the destroyers charging toward them. Her presence alone radiated power. She was the final monument of an empire that believed steel could conquer destiny. Her 18-inch guns angled slightly downward, ready to fire, their dark mouths wide enough to swallow hope. The American destroyers continued forward. Admiral Kurita watched from his bridge as the outlines sharpened into unmistakable shapes. 3 destroyers attacking a fleet of battleships. No hesitation, no retreat, only acceleration and steel throwing itself into a storm. It was irrational. It was suicidal. It was impossible. It was real. The Japanese command officers stared in silence that bordered on disbelief, unable to process what their eyes presented. They had expected a retreat. They had expected collapse. They had expected the battle already won. What confronted them instead defied doctrine, training, logic, war. The ocean shifted from silent to living metal as gun crews across both formations prepared for first impact. Water trembled. Decks vibrated. Air thickened. Every heartbeat echoed like artillery. And then the moment came when history changed shape. When the first American destroyer turned toward the Japanese fleet, history stopped breathing. The Philippine Sea erupted into motion as the destroyers pushed forward, their bows rising and falling over the heaving surface like blades through muscle. Engines groaned under strain. Turbines shrieked. Steam pounded within the chambers below deck, valves trembling on the edge of structural failure. The ocean ahead churned into whitewater. Spray torn violently by wind accelerated through compressed space between racing hulls. The horizon widened like a wound being split open, revealing the immense dark shapes of Japanese battleships driving forward at attack speed. The scale difference was obscene. The American destroyers appeared fragile, skeletal by comparison, each barely over 2,000 tons of steel, while Yamato alone displaced more than 70,000, 35 times greater. Her hull stretched nearly 3 football fields in length, towering above the sea like a moving cliff. Her main battery turrets, 3 in number, each carried twin 18-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighing more than a car and capable of traveling over 25 miles to strike with enough kinetic force to rip open a destroyer from bow to stern like paper under a razor. Her secondary batteries dwarfed even the primary guns of the American ships. She was built to annihilate fleets, built to erase enemies without being touched, built to define the meaning of naval domination. She was the ultimate expression of a doctrine that believed steel and honor could shape destiny. Yet doctrine was already failing. Radar operators aboard Yamato struggled to identify the charging destroyers, clearly due to atmospheric distortion and sea clutter. Early bearings were uncertain, and fire controls struggled to stabilize recalculations as speeds shifted violently. Japanese gunnery still relied heavily on visual range finding, practiced through decades of tradition and faith in human skill. Binoculars, optical directors, muscle memory, intuition refined under pressure. The fog impaired these entirely. The destroyers used this to their advantage, weaving into the haze, disappearing momentarily before reappearing at closer distance, narrowing the firing window that Yamato depended upon. The Americans exploited the battlefield like a knife exploiting a seam in armor. Behind them, escort carriers of Taffy III, slow-built support vessels not intended for frontline combat, turned hard to escape. Their decks groaned under strain, propellers churning through water desperately. Aircraft scrambled, launching partially fueled and underarmed, taking to the air without full ordnance simply to get airborne. Pilots felt their wheels leave steel, with hearts beating against ribs, realizing that they were not taking off to strike, but to survive. Many took flight with only machine guns and empty bomb racks, yet they lifted off regardless, prepared to attack armored giants with whatever ammunition remained. They flew because there was no alternative. Retreat was impossible. The battleships were already closing. Across American decks, messages crackled through radios, voices tight, controlled, urgent. No panic, only absolute clarity. Stand between carriers and battleships or watch them die. The destroyers tightened formation, bows slicing forward. Spray blinded vision, but hands remained locked to rails and controls. Steel vibrated. The world shrank to the sound of engines, wind, and the unstoppable beating of war. The context that shaped this moment was rooted deep in strategic calculation. Months earlier, General Douglas MacArthur had vowed to return to the Philippines after its fall. He returned with an armada, the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the Pacific, supported by dozens of escort carriers. The Japanese command, desperate to halt the momentum of American advance, launched a multi-pronged naval assault, a series of coordinated movements designed to split American forces, luring heavy units away while sneaking battleships through the archipelago to strike the vulnerable invasion fleets. The battle for Leyte Gulf had unfolded as a chaotic, sprawling clash involving deception, sacrifice, and brutal attrition. Kurita's center force, battered yet still formidable, had slipped past initial air assaults and now surged north through the San Bernardino Strait, believing an undefended passage awaited. They expected retreating remnants. They found instead the full resolve of Taffy III. The Japanese fleet moved toward the American ships with the confidence of overwhelming power. Yamato's bridge crackled with reports, officers relaying range and bearing, calculating angles, predicting firing solutions. Kurita stood rigid, watching gray shapes move against the boundary of vision. The idea that destroyers were charging head-on seemed ridiculous. Suicide was not a tactic that rational commanders employed. Yet there they were, accelerating, committing, refusing hesitation. The Japanese officers exchanged glances that carried disbelief. Naval warfare followed rules, engagement ranges, armor ratings, fire design, acceptable losses. But the destroyers of Taffy III were abandoning every rule simultaneously. On the American side, radar screens flickered with readings, bearing lines tightening into converging paths. Radar technology offered what Japanese doctrine lacked: precision beyond sight. Fire control rooms aboard the destroyers calculated trajectory, wind resistance, pitch and roll, enemy bearing, speed and angle. The Americans did not rely on human intuition alone. They used mathematics. Engineering replaced tradition. Machines replaced assumption. It was a new form of warfare, cold, analytical, unforgiving. A destroyer's 5-inch guns had nowhere near the range or destructive output of Yamato's weapons, but they could fire rapidly, adjusting electronically guided corrections faster than visual systems could compensate. They could place shells accurately enough to tear apart exposed superstructures, radar systems, bridge glass, crew stations, rangefinders, blinding giants even if unable to break armor. The Japanese believed American destroyers would stay at distance, firing ineffectively before fleeing. They never imagined a direct charge. Their assumptions had been built upon a worldview where honor dictated engagement range and brute force dictated outcome. But the Americans of Taffy III were fighting for survival. Honor meant nothing if they failed to protect the carriers filled with men behind them. Courage meant advancing into fire so devastating it could evaporate a ship instantaneously. Calculation meant closing distance until torpedoes could strike at lethal range. If they died, they died. But they would die moving forward. As the destroyers accelerated, their torpedo crews prepared the weapons that might decide the impossible. The Mark 15 torpedo, nearly 24 feet long, weighing thousands of pounds, carried a warhead capable of tearing through even battleship armor if detonated at optimal angle. For torpedoes to be effective, destroyers required proximity. miles closer than safety permitted, closer even than logic allowed. Charging battleships with torpedoes was akin to sprinting face-first into artillery fire. It was insane. It was necessary. Hull's crew tightened straps, knuckles white from strain. Johnston's gun teams loaded ammunition at rapid intervals, hands bruised by steel and speed. Heermann's engines roared, plates shaking like thunder rolling through metal bone. Officers shouted coordinates, correcting minute deviations with split-second reflexes. Depth gauges trembled. The sea flashed with sunlight as fog evaporated into steam around burning exhaust. Then sound ripped the air apart. A thunderous crack beyond the limits of comprehension erupted from the Japanese battle line. Yamato had fired her first salvo. 18-inch shells vaulted into the sky, each rising with a roar that resembled the tearing of mountains from earth. The air itself shook, compressed and released in violent pulses. The shells arced high, disappearing into the gray light, vanishing from sight, but not from memory. The trajectory stretched across miles, physics applied on a scale seldom witnessed by human senses. Seconds later, the ocean exploded into colossal columns of water that rose hundreds of feet, crashing down with thunder so deep it resonated through skulls and spines. Shock waves lifted destroyers momentarily from the sea, rattling every bolt, every joint, every rib inside every man aboard. The noise did not sound like explosions. It sounded like the world breaking. More salvos followed. Water vaporized into steam, where shells slammed into surface tension with impacts measured in godlike force. Waves radiated outward from each blast, colliding with hulls and cracking against decks. Men clung to railings with hands seared raw from friction. The destroyers weaved through rising walls of water like insects dodging meteors. Eternal seconds stretched into minutes. The sky flashed with impact plumes. The sea boiled white beneath shock columns. Still the destroyers advanced. American guns opened fire. 5-inch shells screamed through air, leaving white trails before slamming into the upper superstructures of Japanese cruisers. Metal splintered. Antennas snapped. Observation towers shattered. Glass cascaded. Japanese gunners flinched beneath shrapnel ripping across platforms. Smoke unfurled from ruptured decks. Johnston's first torpedo spread launched. The tubes released with mechanical violence, propulsion systems igniting with a roar that shook the aftmost bulkheads. The torpedoes dove into the sea, wakes cutting through surface like white lightning, angling for cruisers looming ahead. Radar fed constant adjustments to guns, enabling rapid bursts aimed at rangefinders and radar domes on enemy ships. Within seconds, Japanese fire control teams found themselves blinded, struggling to recalibrate as their instruments tore apart piecemeal. Kurita's officers watched in shock as destroyers accelerated further, closing distance instead of breaking away. It defied explanation. It defied war. It defied common sense. Salvos continued hammering the sea, raising waterspouts in relentless rhythm. One barrage landed close enough to engulf Johnston entirely in a column of white fury. Men aboard held onto steel as the ship vanished into the explosion. Silence reigned momentarily. Spray collapsed. From the fading mist, Johnston re-emerged, battered but alive, bow cutting through foam like a spear. Pilots overhead watched and felt chills radiating through their limbs. The destroyers looked impossibly small against the ocean of steel bearing down upon them. Yet they continued forward, cutting distance like blades cleaving through armor. The first torpedo found its mark. A massive column of smoke erupted from the side of a Japanese cruiser, flames ripping outward as compartments ignited. The explosion shook surrounding ships, shockwaves rippling across water. The sudden damage shattered confidence across the Japanese line. If one torpedo could strike, more could follow. If destroyers could reach this range, doctrine had collapsed. In seconds, the nature of the battle changed. The destroyers pressed harder. Engines screamed. Sweat stung eyes. Hands bled. Adrenaline replaced fatigue. Orders crackled, clipped and sharp. Shells impacted water, sending fragments of steel and bone into spray. Men were thrown from feet, but they rose again, reaching for weapons and controls with shaking determination. Courage no longer felt like bravery, but like inevitability. They were beyond choice. American aircraft of suddenly, strafing Japanese decks with machine gun fire, attempting to disrupt operational rhythm rather than destroy hulls. Pilots fired until ammunition ran dry, then held position overhead simply to distract enemy gunners. Some dropped empty fuel tanks as improvised weapons. Others circled, waiting for death. None turned away. The Japanese fleet reeled under the psychological blow. Officers reported destroyers closing at speed. Confusion spread. Yamato's guns thundered again, recoil shaking her superstructure violently. Shells tore sky and ocean apart, but destroyers maneuvered unpredictably, zigzagging violently, weaving at suicidal proximity to avoid predictive fire. Japanese gunners cursed the erratic motion, calculations collapsing under tight approach angles. The distance closed further. The destroyers now entered zones so close that Yamato's main guns could no longer depress sufficiently to target them directly. The American vessels had forced the most powerful battleship in history into a disadvantage through audacity alone. The Japanese command realized they were facing something they had never prepared for, an enemy that valued survival above honor, engineering above myth, mathematics above tradition. The battle transformed from expected dominance to desperate adaptation, and still the destroyers charged. Then the order came: full speed charge. The destroyers drove deeper into the inferno until the distance separating them from the Japanese battle line collapsed into visual range, every shape sharpened by the cold glare of exposed metal and flame. Johnston, Hull, and Heermann plunged through walls of water thrown skyward by colossal artillery strikes, hulls shuddering under pressures that pushed rivets to the edge of failure. Beneath their decks, men clung to machinery and bulkheads, slick with sweat and condensation, the noise of the engines merging into a continuous growl, so loud that bones vibrated. Each new explosion sent tremors rippling through steel frames like convulsions, and yet course corrections continued with flawless precision. Helmsmen gripping wheels with knuckles turned ghost white, their arms aching under violent strain, eyes fixed on bearing markers, oscillating wildly with every shock wave. Nothing about the charge resembled heroism. It was desperation weaponized into motion, survival hardened into steel. The ocean around them seemed almost animate, rising violently beneath their hulls, as though the sea itself were attempting to wrench them apart. But the destroyers refused to buckle. Their bows plunged down waves with teeth like blades, carving toward death with unbreakable momentum. Then Johnston unleashed her first full broadside. 5-inch guns roared with the ferocity of 1,000 thunderclaps, barrels recoiling violently as shells streaked across open water toward the armored superstructures of Japanese cruisers, now looming near enough to reveal crew movement on their decks. The firing rate was relentless, 20 rounds per minute from each mount, a continuous hammering rhythm that filled the bridge with noise so deafening it reduced all other sound to vibration. The shells detonated along railings, signal platforms, AA mounts, tearing through radar domes and rangefinders with surgical brutality, shredding exposed men on open decks in grisly bursts of flame and shrapnel. Hull and Heermann joined in moments later, their guns adding to the cacophony of steel ripping air and metal ripping flesh. Smoke streamed from barrels, gun crews working with mechanical precision, ramming shells into britches with hands bleeding through soaked gloves. Japanese ships returned fire, their secondary batteries and rapid anti-aircraft guns stitching patterns of red tracers across the air like burning thread. Bullets and fragments ricocheted off destroyer hulls in showers of sparks, slicing through bulkheads, tearing into flesh. Men fell silently, replaced instantly by others filling their positions without hesitation. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano took multiple hits near her bow, the barrage ripping into her structure, detonating ammunition lockers, sending a column of smoke spiraling upward. Fire broke from her deck, licking across steel plates as crewmen scrambled with hoses and extinguishers. But the damage had already slowed her advance, forcing adjustments across the battle line. Then the first torpedo strike landed. One of Johnston's torpedoes slammed into a cruiser amidships, triggered by contact fused beneath the armored belt. The detonation ripped open steel as though it were cloth, lifting the massive vessel from the water in a violent upward arc before dropping it back with sickening force. Flames erupted from ruptured fuel lines, smoke gushing into the sky like volcanic discharge. The shock wave reverberated across the formation, sending tremors through the Japanese line. Officers aboard Yamato watched incredulously as one of their own burned beneath the force of a weapon they believed impossible to deliver at such proximity. It destroyed assumptions faster than steel. If torpedoes could reach cruisers, they could reach battleships. If destroyers could strike, they could kill. The impossible was happening. Kurita knew at that moment that the battle was no longer a pursuit of victory, but a struggle to avoid humiliation. The determination of the destroyers shook the Japanese command to its foundation. Reports screamed across bridges, officers shouting ranges, fire requests, bearing adjustments. Confusion spread. Radar interference increased. Visual targeting broke down under the erratic weaving of the destroyers and the smoke spreading over water. Yamato's fire control officers recalculated again and again, adjusting for sea state, ship roll, distance contraction, but every adjustment slipped behind the pace of reality. The destroyers moved too fast, too close, too unpredictably. Johnston took a massive hit. An 18-inch shell landed so close that the near miss lifted the ship partially from the water, bending internal frames, rupturing fuel lines, shredding communications equipment, and killing men across multiple stations. Shrapnel tore into Captain Evans' vest and sliced through the skin of his face and arms, blood misting across the bridge. Fire erupted below decks. Water flooded compartments. Smoke filled passageways. Men coughed until blood spilled from their mouths, choking the acrid burn of cordite and burning insulation. Yet the ship continued forward. Hull followed into the storm, taking hit after hit from enemy cruisers as she pressed deeper still. Multiple shells slammed into her hull, tearing gaping holes that vented steam and flame. Bulkheads collapsed. Valves sheared apart. Water flooded engine rooms. Yet Hull refused to die. She continued firing, guns blazing until barrels glowed red-hot. Torpedo tubes released and others spread into the path of the massive battleships, closing distance rapidly. The ocean now churned like a cauldron of fire and salt and steel. Airmen closed to within near-suicidal range. Japanese cruisers turned their secondary batteries toward her, unleashing a torrent of explosive shells that shredded her decks and blasted men from positions in torn pieces. Still, she surged forward, leaning into the sea with wild determination, pushing her engines to catastrophic strain. Her torpedoes launched directly toward battleships too stunned to believe what they were witnessing. Above, aircraft from the escort carriers dove repeatedly into walls of anti-aircraft fire. Pilots who had taken off with nearly empty ammunition racks now made strafing runs, using only machine guns, launching their final rounds into enemy bridges and gunnery stations. Some pilots resorted to dropping tools and equipment from cockpits as improvised weapons. Others flew low enough to force gunners to duck and disrupt coordination. Many never pulled up again, disappearing into explosions that erased steel and human form without distinction. The sky turned into chaos, a blurred whirl of flame and smoke, and wings torn apart mid-turn. Below, on the deck of Johnston, 2 gun mounts jammed from heat stress and damage. Crewmen climbed onto the mounts under fire, striking mechanisms with hammers and crowbars, while shards of metal tore skin from their bodies. The guns came back online. Men roared with fury and relief, and the barrels resumed their violent rhythm, pounding shells into the Japanese formation with unstoppable urgency. The Japanese heavy cruiser, Chokai, took multiple torpedo strikes and detonated violently, flames engulfing her superstructure until a final explosion tore her apart, sending steel shrapnel spiraling skyward like black leaves in a storm. The blast stunned crews across both fleets. Yamato herself was forced to make evasive maneuvers to avoid torpedoes streaking beneath white foam trails. The battleship adjusted course, slowing her advance and causing confusion in formation alignment. The Japanese line faltered, hesitation spreading like infection. Kurita watched the scene unfolding before him and felt his strategic certainty collapse. These were not escort remnants fleeing. These were destroyers hurling themselves into annihilation to protect carriers that should never have been exposed. The Japanese admiral tried to process the scale of reversal, the idea that honor could be broken by desperation, that precision could defeat myth, that technology could silence tradition. Reports of damage streamed in. Cruisers burning, formations breaking, confusion rising. Officers shouted conflicting directives. Signals crossed. Control dissolved. Meanwhile, Johnston was dying. Fires raged below deck. Pumps struggled to keep up with flooding. The ship listed heavily as compartments filled. Survivors in engineering rooms crawled through twisted steel, pulling wounded comrades whose limbs hung loose and broken. The roar of the turbine slowed, sputtering, then resumed under manual override. Steam scalded exposed skin. Men screamed in silence because the noise of battle drowned every human sound. Captain Evans stood bloodied and half-blinded, hands gripping rails slick with his own blood. He continued issuing orders with voice unshaken, his uniform shredded by shrapnel, one arm immobilized, eyes burning with salt and smoke. The destroyer continued forward as though guided not by machinery, but by sheer will. Hull absorbed hit after hit until fires tore through her interior like living creatures devouring lungs and bone. The sea rushed in, swallowing compartments, sending men tumbling through darkness. She began to slow, bow dipping beneath waves, stern lifting upward. Yet her guns continued firing. Crewmen remained at posts until the last shell fired. As water surged over her decks, men shouted final firing coordinates over failing radios, voices cracking, refusing surrender. Holes slipped beneath the surface, her hull groaning like a wounded animal, disappearing under white foam and black smoke. Heermann continued alone, weaving through enemy fire with insane agility, zigzagging so violently that her hull creaked under extreme torsion. Torpedoes from her tubes streaked forward toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro, forcing another evasive turn. Shells detonated against her sides, tearing away plating, exposing internal structure. Men fell, blood-soaked steel, but her guns kept firing. Her engines refused to die. Johnston finally reached minimum distance, too close for Yamato's main batteries to fire upon her directly. The massive barrels elevated, adjusting desperately for angle, but could not depress sufficiently. Secondary guns opened fire instead, blasting holes into Johnston's ribs with concussive bursts. Men were thrown through air like broken figures of cloth. The destroyer staggered beneath the assault, her deck becoming a shredded battlefield of blood and ruined steel. Still she pressed onward. At last, the final torpedo spread from Johnston launched, the tubes shuddering violently as the heavy weapons slid into the ocean. The wake streaked forward toward the Japanese battleships, engines screaming beneath water. The ocean itself seemed to pause. Japanese officers screamed orders. Engines reversed. Rudders twisted. Yamato turned hard to avoid incoming torpedoes, her massive bulk groaning under pressure. Her maneuver effectively removed her from firing position and forced a break in attack momentum. The greatest battleship in history turned to flee a destroyer. The destruction of certainty echoed across the Japanese bridge. Cold silence filled the command deck. In that instant, Kurita understood the truth. Victory was gone. The battle was unwinnable. The destroyers had shattered the spine of his assault. He saw his fleet burning, saw confusion rippling through formations like cracks through stone. He saw chaos replacing dominance. And the order came, retreat. It was unthinkable. It was humiliating. It was final. The Japanese fleet turned away, smoke trailing behind crippled ships limping through wreckage and flame. Yamato retreated into fog, disappearing like a wounded phantom into the gray wall of sea and sky. The battle that should have ended American presence in the Philippines instead ended Japanese naval supremacy. On Johnston, the final moments unfolded slowly. Fires raged through steel corridors. Flooding reached critical compartments. The ship listed further. Captain Evans gave the order to abandon ship, voice ragged but steady. Men crawled and stumbled to the rails, many refusing life jackets so others might survive. Some stood at damaged guns that no longer fired, staring at the horizon with empty eyes. The destroyer that had changed history began its final descent. As the bow dipped beneath the waterline, waves poured over the deck. Men leapt into the sea, clinging to debris. The ocean swallowed Johnston piece by piece, her structure groaning until the final section disappeared beneath foam. Captain Evans remained aboard until water closed over the bridge. He vanished with his ship. Survivors floated in oil-black water, bodies bruised and burned, lungs gasping against choking fumes. Debris drifted like dead leaves across a poisoned pond. Cries for help echoed faint and broken. Some prayed, some whispered, some stared upward at the sky that now appeared impossibly peaceful. Escort carriers circled back, recovering survivors when possible. Medical crews pulling broken bodies from ocean swells, hands shaking as they lifted men whose wills had outlasted human limits. Pilots landed on decks scarred by flame and wreckage, faces hollow, silent tears staining cheeks black with soot. The sea began to calm. Smoke thinned. Silence returned. The ocean that had moments earlier been a vortex of violence now carried gentle waves beneath the sky cleared of fog. The horizon stretched unbroken. The sun fell through gathering clouds, light spreading across water in soft golden stripes, illuminating a graveyard that floated in silence. American sailors stood along rails, eyes locked on the empty horizon into which the Japanese fleet had disappeared. Their faces carried expressions carved by the knowledge that survival had been purchased with fire and blood. They had just witnessed the impossible, destroyers charging battleships and winning. The battle changed naval warfare forever. The age of the battleship died in those waters. Technology replaced mass. Precision replaced mythology. Courage replaced doctrine. The world understood that aggression could be defeated by intelligence, that engineering could defeat brute strength, that the future of naval power belonged not to giants, but to those who could fire accurately from beyond sight. In Tokyo, shock spread like disease. Reports arrived of battleships retreating from destroyers. Admirals stared in disbelief at words that defied comprehension. Pride fractured. Faith shattered. The myth of unbreakable steel dissolved. In Washington, the news arrived quietly. Men in uniforms studied maps and casualty lists. They understood at once that the war had changed direction permanently. They understood that sacrifice had saved thousands. The sea settled. Waves rolled gently against steel. Wreckage drifted like ghosts. The sun lowered further, turning the ocean black beneath copper-colored light. They built not just ships, but certainty. And certainty ended the age of battleships. When the sea calmed, only the echoes of range remained.